Hello, New Life Church. Glad to have you joining us today. First Sunday of March. It seems like spring is here, and I don't know about you, but that puts a smile on my face. We're in our third week right now looking at the book of 1 Peter in the New Testament in a series of messages I'm simply calling Hope 2021. A few things that we've seen so far and that we need to keep in mind are these. Peter, in this letter, he's writing to Christians in what is now northern Turkey, many of whom are refugees from Jerusalem and Israel. Some are Jewish ethnic, others are just Gentiles. As refugees, those that would have come from Israel, their possessions are minimal and they are despised by Rome and likely by the local citizens in this area that they have migrated toward. Their hopes in their Jewish nation are shattered, and hopes in their wealth or in their jobs or in the security of close-knit family and community are also very, very damaged. It's abundantly clear, Peter writes to them, that Jesus is their primary hope. He is their living hope. All their other hopes have died or are dying. And then last week I tried to communicate that after their future hope secured through Christ, that after having their future hope secured through Christ, they should be motivated to live holy lives, because right living minimizes how much we have to hope for, because it minimizes how much goes wrong in our lives. So that brought us up to verse 16 of chapter 1. We aren't going to move through the whole book this slowly, but we're going to look at the next 6 verses, starting in verse 17 of 1 Peter. This is what it says. Since you call on a Father who judges each man's work impartially, live your lives as strangers here. We're going to come back to that word, in reverent fear. For you know that it was not with perishable things such as gold or silver that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. He was chosen before the creation of the world, but was revealed in these last times for your sake. Through him you believe in God, who raised him from the dead and glorified him, and so your faith and hope are in God. Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth, so that you have sincere love for your brothers, love one another deeply from the heart, Peter says. There are a couple of words that jump out in these early verses that I just kind of gravitated around, and where we're going to camp out throughout much of the rest of this message. All right. The first is in verse 17 when Peter repeats the word strangers, the same word, root word from verse 1. So think immigrants, think refugees, think exiles. And then the second word is in verse 18, the word redeemed. Both of these words allude to a change in status or circumstances. The word strangers speaks of an unwelcome change in status. These converts to Christianity, many of them being far away from their home in Israel, would certainly have wished to be back in the land that had been promised by God to the Jewish people. From their perspective, the promise of God has unraveled. The promise had been taken from them. But the word redeemed would bring up images of a much anticipated change in status, a much more preferable change in status. Peter uses the word in relation to the rescue from sin that believers in Jesus have experienced, and the incredible relief that comes from that rescue. But the Jewish believers, in addition to what all of the Christians would have thought about the Jewish believers, almost certainly would have also thought of how their ancestors had been rescued from brutal slavery in Egypt many, many centuries earlier. Let me remind you of something that I have shared before. When you are facing a difficult situation, like these strangers in a foreign land were certainly experiencing, when you are facing a difficult situation and you think, what should I do? How can I fix this? Remember this, we were never created to have to deal with the consequences of a fallen world, with pain-filled relationships, with wounded people, with a broken creation. In Romans chapter 8, verse 21, Paul writes about creation being liberated from its bondage to decay. You see, in the Garden of Eden, God created a paradise for mankind to enjoy. But he refused to make men and women as robots who were pre-programmed to love him, pre-programmed to obey him. He knew that genuine love needed to be a choice. And while his heart thrilled while God's heart thrilled with those who purposely chose him, he aches for those who don't choose him. The image maybe to keep in mind of what this looks like is from the story that Jesus told about the story that we oftentimes call the Prodigal Son in the Gospel of Luke. Of course, the Father loves his Son, but he loves him so much that he's willing to permit the Son to take his inheritance early before the Father dies, to leave home, to live as a stranger in a foreign land, to indulge in sin to his heart's content, which eventually leaves him hoping that he could return to what he has lost. All of that comes about from a father who loves him too much to control him. When Adam and Eve chose not God, their sin, the word that I thought of is their sin toxicized life, and life began to spiral downward in directions that God never intended for his human creation, for his earthly creation. It continues to create an ever increasingly unwelcome, hostile environment for all of mankind to live in, for the rest of God's creatures to live in as well, as we have continued to corrupt and poison this world that we live in. Entrenches us, that decay of this world and how so much continues to go wrong with it in ever increasing ways. It entrenches us deeper into stranger status. We weren't designed to live in a world that is so messed up the way that our world is messed up. This world keeps decaying farther and farther from what we were originally created by God to live in and to experience. So related to hope, let me give you a word of hope, okay? Don't cling to unrealistic expectations that life should always be smooth. Those expectations lead to hopes that often get unmet, and we're worse off in the long run. Now, I might be wrong in this next thought, but I looked at it from a variety of different perspectives, and I think it's accurate. Since the temporary problems that we suffer from in our world can almost always be traced back to choices that God would not have recommended, the best solutions to those problems can only come from redemptive qualities of God. God is redeeming. God is claiming back his creation. God is claiming back parts of our lives. And there's that word redemption again, which comes out in verse 18 of the text that we read earlier. So what redemptive qualities are we talking about? Well, these are some that came to my mind. The redemptive quality of selfless love, other-centered love. The redemptive quality of a willingness to bear the consequences for other people's mistakes. Or in other words, another way to put it is the redemptive quality of paying the price ourselves that we shouldn't have to pay necessarily. The redemptive quality of grace-filled treatment for guilty people. The redemptive quality of not withholding kindness and compassion from hurting and pain-filled people. The redemptive quality of not harboring grievances against those who have injured or wounded us. I thought of these redemptive qualities: selfless love, paying the price ourselves, grace-filled treatment, kindness and compassion, and not harboring grievances. And I thought, imagine how much hope we would have if we could trust that people in positions of authority operated on these principles. Imagine how much hope we would have if everybody in Washington, D.C. embraced all of these qualities and lived by them. Part of the reason that America is becoming an increasingly hopeless place, and the world as well. Part of the reason that we are so divided right now is simply because we are faced with challenges that God never intended for a nation to have to resolve, and actually he never intended that a nation would create the problems that we now need to resolve. And the second aspect is this: few of the potential problem solvers genuinely exhibit redemptive qualities of God's. No wonder their solutions are so flawed and lead to even worse unintended consequences after we impose failed solutions. Which makes me think that one of the greatest lessons about hope that we might learn is this, that while we can't control the behavior of those who might be able to resolve our challenges, we can sometimes become the solution for other people's hopes to be met. We're going to come back to that in a little bit, all right? So the word strangers here, it has a couple of applications. One is this: many of the Christians reading Peter's letter were literally strangers or refugees in this area of northern Turkey, about 1,000 miles away from where they lived. But the second application is that we are all strangers living in a world that is no longer what God designed for us to live in. So I ask myself this question as I look at this verse that speaks about live your lives as strangers here. What would have been the hopes that those strangers in northern Turkey would have had? Let me first consider what their secondary hopes would have looked like, okay? Because this is what I think their secondary hopes would have revolved around. Hope that they could provide for their families. Husbands and wives alike would have desperately hoped that their spouses wouldn't die. Life was already hard enough. But to lose a wife, to lose a husband would have been just shattering for them. They would have had hope that they could connect with someone who made them feel welcome. Many of us had to go to, during our childhood, we moved to a different school and remember that feeling, that first day of school, wondering, is anybody going to be willing to sit next to me at the lunch table? They would have had the hope that they wouldn't be taken advantage of, that they wouldn't be exploited, or that they wouldn't be abused in this foreign land. Parents would hope that their kids wouldn't adopt the worst practices of their new culture. They would have had hope that one of the other immigrants with them wouldn't do something stupid and inflame the hatred of the local citizens. And of course, they would have had the hope that their new football team in northern Turkey might win the Super Bowl since their home team hasn't won it for 60 years. Those hopes are similar to many of the hopes that we have in life. That's why I think they would have had these types of hopes. We hope that we can provide for our families. We hope that our marriages stay intact. We hope that our family members don't die. We hope that we have good, solid friends. We hope that our kids aren't mistreated. We hope that we don't enter a season of persecution. We hope that we don't get blamed or associated with the foolish decisions of other Christians that make us look bad. I think it's helpful for us to remember this, that most of our greatest hopes are connected to our greatest fears. And it would have been the same for these strangers. Their greatest fears were that their problems wouldn't wander into the territory of being unresolvable. But most of our greatest fears are tied to problems that ultimately are just temporary. I know most of my fears are that way. Now listen to me. I do not want to minimize the pain or the fear or the suffering that people undergo, that many of us here at New Life Church have undergone over the years, or the huge longings and hopes that have gone unmet and unfulfilled. That pain, those fears, they're real. They wound us, sometimes very, very deeply. They are legitimate. What I am saying, though, is this, that having a larger, comprehensive picture has often helped my hopes, has often helped put my hopes and my unfulfilled hopes especially into perspective. So, some reflective thoughts on what their secondary hopes would have been, but what would their primary hope have been? And here's what I think. I think they ultimately would have hoped to regain the life that they had lost, the life that they had back in the promised land. Which is pretty much exactly what my greatest hopes can be boiled down to. I'd like to regain everything that was lost by mankind in the paradise of the Garden of Eden. I hope for eternal rest. I hope for peace. I hope for problem-free living. It might not be the best thing to hope for. I might talk about that another time. I hope for something that looks like what heaven looks like. So these Jewish followers of Jesus, not the Gentile ones, not the Gentile Christians, but the Jewish followers of Jesus almost certainly would have been thinking, God, just like our ancestors, languished in Egypt for 400 years. Just as our ancestors were later exiled into Babylon for 70 years, we find ourselves banished from the promised land again. Do you understand, God, the nature of the word promise? The promised land. God, fulfill your promise to us once and for all. Redeem us, God. And Peter explains then in verses 18 and 19 what God has done related to this word redemption. He says that it was not with perishable things such as gold, silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your forefathers. That empty way of life that he speaks about could have been understood by ethnic Jewish Christians as the ongoing need for sacrifices to be brought to the temple in their temple worship. Sacrifices that only covered up sins, never fully removed them. But that empty way of life that Peter talks about would have been understood probably by Gentile Christians in a very similar way, not related to the temple in Jerusalem, but related to the temples that were all around them, because their spiritual heritage included pagan idolatry. This was an area of the world that was saturated with idols and with temples that represented Greek gods or Roman gods or even emperor worship. Bring your sacrifice to the temple and get some relief or protection. But it wouldn't last. So they'd have to bring another sacrifice later on. And maybe sometimes it was made of silver, or maybe it was gold. Oftentimes it would have been animal sacrifices. Peter is saying this: you weren't redeemed from your emptiness, from your hopelessness by silver or gold or through the sacrifices of animals. And he explains in the next verse, you were redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. It seems to me that the fulfillment of my hopes, the resolution of my problems, almost always come with some type of a cost. Try to think of a few examples. Our child gets sick. We hope that our child's health gets better and returns to normal. Usually that's going to require the cost of medicine, or the cost of a medical bill, or maybe the cost of taking a day off work to stay with your child. We hope we can get pregnant. Well, that usually doesn't cost anything, but prenatal care has a price that goes along with this. With it, I hope that we have a great vacation. Ask my wife sometime, or ask me about how much money we spent on food in Los Angeles when we were there a month ago. All right, I hope I passed my final exam, whatever, for those who are students. Well, the cost isn't going to be financial for that. It's usually in the form of time spent studying. Granted, there are exceptions to this. Okay, I hope I have good weather for fishing. Well, that one doesn't seem to cost me, or doesn't seem to cost God anything, for example, because sometimes we do get the good weather. And we do nothing to pay for that, and it doesn't cost God anything to work that out for us either, all right? But there is, apart from those secondary hopes that we have, there is this ultimate hope. I hope to spend eternity in heaven's paradise. Of course, the price for that, as we know as Christ followers, was the very lifeblood of Jesus himself, which is what Peter tells us in verse 19. So some thoughts to consider related to that. To all of this, I should say. Fulfilled hopes generally cost someone something. Redemption simply isn't free. Second thought, sometimes we aren't capable of paying the cost for our hopes to be fulfilled. And we get frustrated with that. There's angst in our hearts related to that. A third thought is this: Christ was willing to pay the price for our greatest hopes to be fulfilled. But I asked myself this question this week: what if he had only been as willing to sacrifice for our needs as we are willing to sacrifice for others' needs? You might need to reflect on that. And then the fourth thought here is, if we want to follow his example, then we will make ourselves available to fulfill other people's hopes. Or dispel other people's fears, even if it costs us something that we would rather not give up personally. And the key to all of that seems to come a few verses later. Dropping down now to verse 22, where this is what Peter writes. Now that you have purified yourselves by obeying the truth so that you have sincere love for your brothers, love one another deeply from the heart. That phrase, now that you have purified yourselves, I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that, okay? Because I think purification is what God does to us based on steps that we take to believe in him, okay? So I think the sense of that verse, I like it better in the New Living Translation where it says, you were cleansed from your sins when you obeyed the truth. Our actions lead to our purification, but God is the one who actually does it. We obey, we believe, he cleanses, he purifies. Now you might remember that earlier I said this. While we can't control the behavior of those who might be able to resolve our challenges, we can sometimes become the solution for other people's hopes to be met. And that happens through selfless love, through the redemptive, other-centered qualities of Christ-like, godly love. It's a deep love. It's a one another love, Peter writes here, that flows out of a heart that has been transformed, that has been softened, a heart that has been satisfied and made content by the great redemption that Jesus Christ has done to fulfill our greatest hopes. In the world that we live in, that type of love is rare. And I think it's becoming increasingly rare, which has the effect of increasing discouragement and despair in our world. With all of the problems that people all around us are facing, the natural tendency for us is to hunker down and to try to take care of our own needs, to try to have our own hopes fulfilled, or try to have our own fears taken away. And when we do that, our love doesn't go out. It stays within us. And Peter is saying we need to love one another deeply from the heart. I think the reason that we have so little hope in our political leaders these days, so little appreciation for our celebrities in Hollywood or New York City, I think the reason we have so much skepticism about news personalities, those who are conveyors of news to us and all, and I dare say even I think one of the reasons we have an ever-growing distrust even in spiritual leaders is because so often their goals seem to be self-serving and their actions are rarely others-centered or others-serving. So I want to wrap this up with 3 mindsets that help me battle best against despair and hopelessness that spring out of this passage. The first is this. I simply cannot afford to raise my expectations too high on hopes that require someone else to meet. Peter doesn't tell his readers, strangers in a new land, hey, go to the long-term citizens that are around you to gain a firm grounding for life. He doesn't do that. It's unrealistic that they would say, yeah, we got so much we're willing to share with you and do it lovingly. A second mindset that helps me is this. In the timeline of eternity, when I realize that Jesus has met my primary hope, a hope that encompasses far more than 99% of the timeline of my existence, when I realize that, contentment in my heart always runs deeper. The perspective of verse 19 changes everything. Redeemed by the precious blood of Jesus Christ, redeemed throughout all of eternity. When I know he has met my greatest hope, well, then the lesser ones fade in significance. And then the third is this. Loving others deeply with a heart that looks to meet other people's needs and their hopes is generally refreshing and recharges the weariness that I, like you, periodically feel. Love one another deeply, Peter says, from the heart. You will fill other people's needs, or the hopes. You will meet their needs. And when we do that, there is something within our spirit that grows and strengthens and gives us greater perseverance for the unmet hopes in life all around us. Would you bow with me for a word of prayer? Every one of us, God, throughout all the seasons of our lives, we live with a variety of different hopes that are not being met. They relate to our families, they relate to our health, they relate to our jobs, our ability to provide for our families, they relate to our relationships. And we, like the Jews would have done in the past, like the Gentile believers would have done in the past, we have tried to get those filled, but they have remained empty because redemption doesn't come from silver or gold or sacrifices that we make in various ways, Lord God, that end up with us continuing to live empty lives. If we can change our perspective and see that this holy God that we serve has provided everything that we need for our greatest hope to be taken care of, if we can focus on realistic expectations for life in a world that God never designed it to look like this, if we can all do all of that, then we will be motivated and compelled from within to show other-centered, to show selfless love for other people, blessing them and becoming the answer to their prayers, the answer to their hopes in ways that we cannot otherwise do. Grow within us, God, in ever-deepening love for you, ever greater hope for what you provide for us, that only you can provide for us. For this world of despair and hopelessness that we live in these days, I pray in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. I want to thank you for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful week. God bless you.